Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the conference on Asia Visions and Voices, Geopolitical Consequences of US-China Tensions. My name is Urania, and I will be your MC for today. We have another insightful and dynamic lineup of discussions planned with distinguished speakers from diverse fields. Please ensure that your phones are on silent as we started. Let me briefly walk through the schedule for today. From 9 to 11 a.m., we will have a panel for new geopolitical landscape and strategies. And then we will have a short tea break from 11 to 11:15 a.m. And next, from 11:50 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., we will have a roundtable discussion. Please note that this session is invitation only. Okay, now we are panel 4, New Geopolitical Landscape and Strategies. Chairing this session is Professor Tun Ren Cheng, the Yunhan Chu Chair Professor at the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science, National Tsinghua University. Please join me in welcome our chair to the stage.
Thank you. In the spirit of the inclusiveness, I would like to at least make something sort of a kind of 30 minutes, for open discussions, to collect, more sort of views from the floors, particularly from, say, Tsinghua University student TSCs. So in the interest of time and in the spirit of inclusiveness, I would like to stick to this rule, which laid out, already 2 days ago, which is that yesterday, 15 minutes for each presentation, and the 10 minutes for each discussion. So we line up 3 papers. One on the economy by Professor Chira Thiwat from the Chulalongkorn University. And second paper is on Asian security by Selina Ho from the Singapore School, at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policies at National University of Singapore. And the third paper is from Vietnam, by Tan on the Vietnam's industrial policy. So each one, 15 minutes. I will have 2 interventions. The first one at the remaining 5 minutes. And the subtext for that is please get ready to jump to the conclusion. And the second intervention at the remaining 2 minutes. And the subtext for that is please conclude. So without further ado, let's now go to the first papers, Asian economies in the sort of with the sort of geopolitical tension in the background. The Professor Chira Thiwat, please.
Thank you, Chair. Very good morning to you all. Let me start by saying a big thank to the co-organizers for the kind invitation so I could be here, and I enjoy very much meeting with old and new colleagues and also many students around the room. As Professor Amitabh mentioned, they will come later on to join this morning discussion. And also yesterday, I think we have quite a very charging day, and we learn a lot as usual. So I hope again this morning we can do the justice to the floor, what we're going to say. What I'm going to present, I think, is very much, might be overlap with what we'll be talking, because the topics of the global geopolitics and economics, global economics, have a lot to, to see from different angle, and to, as economists, and to use Daniel's remark, we don't want to use the bad economics, to judge whatever they use as a pretext of the global geopolitics. So I think it's very much, I think it's important again to remind that the new global geopolitics are still bringing a lot of new narratives and new insight. That include also the new context, strategy and practices that I'm going to see more what happened on the ground for what the ASEAN economies. I have two other colleagues who might also join the discussion later on. The topic is that ASEAN economies in times of U.S.-China tension. Of course, the organizer asking me to look at the topic of that tension, and I see I'm working on ASEAN economies for some time, and I see this is a good time to again look at this reflection of what's happening in our region. I would like to frame my, well, this is again, yes. My discussion on three related topic, I think it's all independent. If you look at the global picture of our region, one part is we've been seeing more recently ongoing shift in ASEAN, China, US triangular trade. And related to that is also we need to reimagining with new ASEAN, the FDI and the supply chain reconfiguration. Many countries, and I think the colleague from Vietnam will talk a lot, and in part I will touch in my paper. And we cannot neglect it. We're not been yet discussed in this session, and yesterday much on China access supply, and we'd like to see as well how that happened in ASEAN economy. So this is very much, I think, it's if you like to have a big picture of the U.S.-China tension in our region, I think this is the three related issues that we need to look at. Let me move next very quickly. Of course, we here sit down in the, people from different fields. I think is we like to, my paper we focus very much on great power rivalry, that ASEAN find themselves facing various dilemmas. And of course, the mistrust between the two is creating and exacerbating security economic dilemmas that include many other dimensions. So my paper, we examine its implication, impact, if possible, that include risk and potential on ASEAN economies. Very quickly on the first issue, ongoing shift. ASEAN been practiced an open regionalism since we launched the ASEAN NAFTA, and we make sure we're not different from the EU, and that's why we like to make sure that all we done is a well integrated intra and extra regional trade and investment. And we cannot deny the role of US and China, these two countries playing well the field with many other countries, well-built ASEAN regional integration. So the past 2 decades and so, ASEAN intensify reliance on China industrial inputs, and of course, they include machinery, and as well as it's, if you're looking from ASEAN, we supply to China raw material intermediate inputs. That's I look from the very beginning of ASEAN-China FTA when it come into the very first picture, 2004. So I examine very closely ASEAN, start to say a lot, the production side, and then also China working on the other side. So this is quite intensified over the years to become as it is now. While the region continue to depend, of course, U.S. as a market, mostly for final goods. So that's on the demand side. So that's my assistant put the wrong word, the demand side. So production side and demand side. And this triangular interdependence among them has been working very well in tandem with the globalization era. The end of the Cold War, WTO, China joined in 2001, and I said again, 2004, we have ASEAN-China FTA into the picture and put in full stream in 2010, 2009, 2010. If you look at this figure very quickly, you can see how open ASEAN is. We are not like EU, 60% of intra-trade. You know, ASEAN only 20 and some, 21, 22 for moving from 25 because of China moving up very quickly. And you see the black line would be the US, and the rest would be Japan, would be Korea, and the UK before the Brexit, of course, it is. Again, now talking about what about the shift since 2018, but as part of the question of trade protectionism, again, China export, what happened to ASEAN, and also particular since the COVID-19 pandemic. Its impact quite on ASEAN-China-US trade, triangular trade, which is adapting, recalibrating for more secure, resilient value chain, not value chain, value chain and trade fragmentation of their product and services. So many countries, you know, the 6 ASEAN that have been active, you know, for Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, all these have increased their good exports affected by trade dispute, despite all this, you know, and also they become excellent alternative production platform for this triangular trade. I'm not going to talk, this is the paper very well by our friend yesterday. I think is the paper that been addressed by Alfred. Alfred, I know that he's here, but Alfred done very well on about the global picture of what happened about the trade restriction, trade protectionism. To use the word of the you know, IMF directing manager, the managing director, she says it's a lot of this new restriction is lack justification, you know, and could worst case is 7% of GDP in worst case scenario, and that is quite worrisome, as many already discussed yesterday about the how we embrace, I mean, seeing new industrial policy as it going nowhere, and also, you know, the half of this industrial policy come the place that we, you know, with, in conjunction with the height of the tariff. And to use her word, I think this is quite a quote, globalization, I mean, this is Georgiova. Globalization didn't work for everybody, so we better off protecting a degree of integration that works for everybody. We discussed yesterday about the regional integration. Maybe that's a kind of thing that we need to use a word about the middle and small nations in that context of that conflict. I don't have time to look at this, about the how U.S.-China in shift show sign of decoupling, and also the EV diversifying, de-risking, more or less, not decoupling, because more, you know, that's part of it. And also we seeing the intensification of ASEAN reliance on China inputs and on production side, and that include machinery because of the moving the other way. So that's important, and Vietnam, our friend, going to say in a moment. Again, so I will go very fast about talking about how ASEAN could be connecting countries, or I think it could be also to be talking about bridge economies. And this is a Nomura forecast from the actual export last year from 4 countries. Vietnam is a rising star here. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. So it could, if they go on, the ASEAN country will be able to, benefit from the export boom. I will not have time too much on talking about this. I leave to you on the Vietnam case. I will move now to the second issue on how ASEAN should reimagine new FDI moving in and that supply chain reconfiguration. Just to say to you that again, investment inflow to ASEAN, ASEAN act as intermediary countries have been just have a surge, and due to relocation and diversification of production away from China. And you can see very well, I don't have the figure, but in fact I just have I don't put a proper number. And in fact, you can see from 2022 is the first time that ASEAN, have more FDI than China. I mean, over here, you look at the graph. 2019, almost, that's before the beginning of then. And the average of ASEAN is almost 200 billion, but now is become almost like 230 billion, occupy around 18% of global GDP. Global GDP, that's a lot. And China been reducing from 23 to around 160, 150. And this year, I heard this year, 2024, is even more. The first 5-6 months, it may be not even 50 billion. So the whole year is just, reduced to a bit 100 billion. So you can see that kind of major change, in that kind of thing. Here again, they're both, of course, investment from China. It could be also non-Chinese firm and Chinese firm as well. I have the figure. In fact, China is still number 4 investor. I mean, compared to in ASEAN, compared to US, EU, or Japan, and but it's moving much more. So again, in a new reconfiguration of supply chain, ASEAN doesn't want to choose side. Will not be possible, disruptive. So impact, I think, is of ASEAN supply chain reconfiguration could be on 3 orders. One is a trade diversion to intermediary to avoid goods flowing directly to China, to the US. But trade diversion to ASEAN, to the ASEAN region, is the least trade diversion. ASEAN now is on hand to create the least trade diversion and the most. I think this is the moment to create the most creation. If you look at the kind of theory to support this, the good time to make ASEAN very productive. And I will not have time, the chair just mentioned to me, that it's important to remind that this is a colleague from Malaysia yesterday talking about the going upstream for ASEAN, for downstream and upstream, the solar case, and also a colleague from Philippines, that I think there's a lot of things to say about it, and that's included R&D and all that, So I think as we pass on this, the case of all these Googles, that produce in ASEAN, they're the first mover in ASEAN because proximity to China. So that's and lower cost and make also Southeast Asia a top choice. Yes, of course, and this on the supply reconfiguration, I could say as well, if you look at about the new competition, the last slide would be competition of the Chinese supplier before they stay inside China, so but now they move into compete with the local suppliers. And this is one table that, show very well how competition heat up on the supply chain for different kind of assembly and products in Southeast Asia. So I will not have time to go into this. This is a new flurry of, the tech company into our region from last year to now with the promise to invest. So this is a real change that will happen to our supply chain. And okay, so I will pass on as well. I will move to just a few words on the third issues that we don't have time. I think is we need also to look at this, is how we look at this issue, despite we don't have time to discuss very much. I think the inflow of Chinese import goods is not only industrial inputs and machinery, as I said, but also the final product. And this is becoming a contentious issue in our region, because I think the part of it, the economic slowdown of China and that excess supply being exported around the world. And in our ASEAN, we very open because of ASEAN-China FTA and reduction of goods. So for what we know now, and we're looking at the price index, is lower than overall or import goods, if you could, the durable, non-durable, and machinery, all that. So, and impact varying. On one hand, the last slide, maintain, help the inflation rate low because of the low price, whether it's a dumping or subsidies. On the other hand, it's negatively impact our manufacturing sector. The economic scale of China, 1.4 billion, the supply, and in our region is smaller. So SMB particular is on the other end, and they're quite complain about how they're going to compete with all these China products. So, this is the picture. I mean, on this issue, we're talking about the increasing trade deficit with China. But of course, it's both. On one part, the deficit coming from supply chain in order to re-export to China. On the other hand, it also involves China goods. So this is a new issue that we discussed very much in our region from last year up to now. And you can see the case of Vietnam, you might like to address. Thailand also, Malaysia, not much Indonesia, but even in Indonesia, they still try to look at all kind of the new restriction for Chinese goods on this. And particularly, I think is the front line will be, that's in fact all they're talking about ASEAN-China FTA and the BRI that helping, the connection, connectivity, transport, logistics, all that, to help China to have a good access in our region, and as well as our goods to China, of course, both ways. But more on the digital economy of ASEAN and China players, from may dominate the ASEAN, that final goods trade, as we all know from Lazada, Shopee, TikTok, and recent case of Temu. I think we have left that to the end. So that's need a lot of response also from our policymakers, and that's what we are now reflecting on all these issues. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the touring the economic landscape for us. And we now go to sort of a security domain. Selena, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheung, and thank you, TSE and Harvard Kennedy School for co-organizing this event. Very nice to meet up with new friends and also to catch up with old ones. So my remarks today is actually taken from an essay that I've contributed to a edited volume on China's arrival on the global stage. So the discussant, I'm sorry, got to read a very long piece, but it's actually an essay for edited volume. And then, so it's not so much of a research article, but an essay of how sketching the Asian security order and what is China's rise, the US-China rivalry, and what has changed, and what does it imply for ASEAN. So my remarks are drawn from that, and it's around these three questions. What are the key features of the post-Cold War Asian security order? How has China's arrival on the global stage and the response that it got from the US actually impacted the Asian security order? And what are the challenges to ASEAN, and how has ASEAN adjusted to these challenges? Now, but before I begin answering these questions, I would like to define what is a regional security order. Now, it's defined as the rules-based interactions among states in their pursuit of private and public security goals. And we know that this order exists in Asia, and even if it's less developed than the one in Europe, we know it exists because regional countries are abiding by a set of rules in their interactions with each other. And such rule-based interactions actually make for predictability, stability, and nonviolent changes. So what are the key features that we know of the post-Cold War Asian security order? And when I say post-Cold War here, I'm referring to the immediate post-Cold War period that lasted for about 10 years, from 1991 or so onwards to the early 2000s. And here, I think it's very well known. A lot of scholars have written about it, including Amitav here, who is my discussant. And there is also a lot of people who have written about this, so I will not spend too much time on it. But basically, we know about the US unipolar moment, which is about a decade or so long. But it is a hegemony that was described as incomplete. So the United States actually undergirded the security order in Asia, but it had to have the support of allies and partners. It could not do it alone, and there was support in the region because there is a shared perception of the United States as a benevolent hegemon whose presence was necessary for peace and stability. And regional states actually work together actively to ensure that the US is kept at the top of the region's hierarchy, and that included China. China was supporting the US role in the region at the time. Now, this second feature of the post-Cold War security order is that it's deeply intertwined with the economic order, meaning that there's the idea of comprehensive security, meaning that security is not just about hard security, but it's also about economic development. It was seen as essential for reconstruction of the new nations, the newly independent states in Southeast Asia. And the regional elites at that time had these neoliberal ideas that economic interdependence would stabilize the region. And a third feature of this post-Cold War Asian security order is a normative structure. That this normative structure governs power relations in the region. The norms and institutions that emerge actually offer protection to smaller states and prevent the dynamics of regional power, of unequal power, and great power rivalry from threatening the sovereignty and security of the smaller states. So at the center of this normative structure, these institutions and a normative structure is actually ASEAN and ASEAN Plus mechanisms. And ASEAN helped socialize major powers in the region into a set of norms and code of behavior that emphasizes things like multilateralism and conflict management. And you have what is known as the ASEAN Way, which is a conflict avoidance system. And it's set in very informal, friendly types of negotiations in a very, very loose kind of setting. Now, over time, and Amitav has, I've drawn from Amitav's work on this, that these values and norms and this regularized institutional interactions among ASEAN elites have actually produced a collective ASEAN identity. So moving on, what has happened is that what happened with China's rise and US-China rivalry? How has that changed the security order in Asia? Well, China's emergence as a peer competitor to the US challenges these three underpinnings, right? And since 2008, there has been a turn in Chinese foreign policy that demonstrated that China believes that its time has come and the West is in decline. Now, this led to insecurities in the US view of its global leadership, that China is a revisionist power that seeks to overturn the status quo. And so it began to undertake measures to delay, if not stop, China's rise. And the manifestations of this, the trade war, the technology war, were actually destabilizing not only to national economies, but also the foundations of the region's security order. So 3 things have changed. From unipolarity, we are looking at bipolarity. While the US remains the leading power, it is actually less preponderant than before. China no longer acquiesces to US dominance in the region. And this bipolarity that has emerged has led to competing and overlapping spheres of influence in Southeast Asia. So this competition for spheres of influence actually destabilizes the region and threatens ASEAN unity. Now, if we think back about the old Cold War and how there are 2 big spheres of influence, 2 blocks, right? But those 2 blocks were stable because there was this tacit recognition from the 2 superpowers that is at that time, which is the United States and Soviet Union, that they recognize that these 2 are their blocks, and they recognize the dominance of their rival in the other bloc and tries not to interfere in their affairs. But in this case, there's no clear spheres of influence that have emerged right now. There is what is described as US dominance in the maritime states, and there is what is described as Chinese dominance in the mainland Southeast Asian states. But as we know today, it is not that clear-cut. Now, why? Because the Chinese have moved into the maritime realm. In 2012, Hu Jintao said that China is going to become a maritime power, and it started to build its navy, its ability to move its ships out. It has acquired ports and bases across the Indian Ocean. It has been very active in the South China Sea. So you can see that China doesn't just confine its activities to mainland Southeast Asia. And then in the other side, in mainland Southeast Asia, among the Mekong states, for instance, the US have started crafting institutions, building institutions in response to what China is doing there. The US-Mekong partnership is one of them in response to the Lower Mekong Initiative. Now, the Mekong region is really almost like a great game right now. Very few people actually pay attention to it, but a lot of fervor is actually going on. There are about 13 regional institutions at the last count where the US is there, the Chinese are there, the Koreans are there, the Japanese are there, the Indians are there, right? So among Southeast Asian states, they have their own institutions, but among these 13 institutions, they are also led by all these major powers in the region. So you can see that there are all these overlapping and competing spheres of influence. It's not so clear-cut, okay, as some people would claim. Now, so this threatens the stability of the entire region. So this bipolarity is not the bipolarity of Kenneth Waltz. It's not that stable. It is a case where bipolarity actually led to overlapping and competing spheres of influence in our region. Now, the second thing that has happened, which is that the US-China economic competition and the region's economic dependency and is on China is actually threatening the economic underpinnings of the Asian security order. Now, a lot of us have already, from yesterday, today, and from my co-panelists, have been talking about the economics of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but there's a lot of data out there that is really quite interesting. But I think the view from the region, and I think Professor Chirag actually mentioned it right now, just now, which is that you can have all these short-term gains, but the longer-term challenges, and that's something that we're truly worried about. Now, let me cite some data. For instance, right? So ASEAN economies collectively accounted for around 30% of US electrical and electronics imports, on par with China in 2022. So on par now for US electrical and electronic imports. Now, in the chip industry, both ASEAN and China accounted for about 34% of US chip imports in 2017. But by 2022, ASEAN's share increased to 48%, while China's share has halved to 17%. So in 2022 as well, FDI flows into ASEAN 6 countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Philippines, reached an all-time high and surpassed FDI inflows into China. So companies have also relocated their businesses from China to some of the ASEAN countries, and particularly Thailand and Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia have actually benefited from this China Plus One diversification strategy. And the region has become an alternative to well-established global supply chains, diverting some of the global manufacturing concentration from China. Chinese firms are also investing in Southeast Asia in order to circumvent US and EU sanctions and restrictions on investments. There's capital flight from China. It's coming to some economies with well-developed financial sectors, including Singapore. But however, the ASEAN's trade reliance on China, while having the US as its top investor and key source of technology transfers, puts it in an increasingly precarious situation if the US-China trade and technology wars intensify. We have been, companies in the region have been subjects of investigations as conduits for Chinese goods. South Asian companies are also plugged into the Chinese supply chain, are also at risk if the United States decide to target companies with high Chinese content in them, in their products. So in the longer term, these disruptions and the costs are actually going to be weighing all these benefits in the short term. So this is a threat to the economic underpinnings of the Asian security order. Now the third aspect that is being challenged is actually the institutional and normative structure centered on ASEAN and the ASEAN way. So what do I mean by that? Basically, the growth of minilaterals and coalitions undermines ASEAN-centered multilateralism, and it calls into question the relevance of ASEAN. ASEAN is also at risk of fracturing. For instance, over the recent, in the past year, the kind of activities that have been happening in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines, right? So China is seen as bullying the Philippines with its lasers and its water cannons. But what is really alarming for Southeast Asia is that, in 1995, during the mischief incident, 1994-1995 period, ASEAN actually made statements referring to calling for peace and calling for stability and for claimants to uphold stability and to restrain themselves in the South China Sea over the mischief reef incident. ASEAN is completely silent this time around. And my Philippine friend is nodding at me right now. And I can tell you, I mean, I think the Filipinos are mad that ASEAN hasn't said anything. So, I mean, you can sense this frustration from the statement of the Philippines Defense Secretary. He actually said in August 2024, 2 months ago, that that ASEAN, to remain relevant and credible, cannot continue to ignore what China is doing in the South China Sea. I think there is a frustration with ASEAN for remaining silent. So all these are challenges to ASEAN and ASEAN way. So how has ASEAN responded to all of these? How have ASEAN adjusted? Other than remaining silent on a lot of issues, right, related to China, there is this ASEAN response is to take into consideration Chinese preferences and interests whenever they make decisions. That happens a lot in the past decade or so. Now, but one of the things that we have been doing, and we have been most active, is in really trying to reinforce the economic foundations of security order. And I'm not going to repeat that because everyone has been talking about that. But what is really interesting for me as a political scientist is this coalescing effect around ASEAN, this rallying effect. And you see Indonesia leading ASEAN in the ASEAN Outlook on the Free and Open Indo-Pacific in response to the US FOIP. And there's also the ASEAN Solidarity Exercise last year, which is the first time that all 10 ASEAN states actually gathered to exercise in the maritime realm. Now, it's a humanitarian crisis that they were looking at, but this is a signal to major powers that we can take care of our own security and we have a stake in the security of the region. But more interestingly, and this is where I draw from my own research and is based on I'm going to show 3 tables, this coalescing effect around Southeast Asia. This is a forthcoming article that my co-author and I have written about. The title is called Elite Perceptions of a China-Led Regional Order in Southeast Asia. And what we are trying to investigate is how do elites view the possibility of China imposing its order in Southeast Asia. Now, the 3 tables that I'm drawing here is only one slice of what we have put in this paper. but it's based on a elite survey, okay, of 6 countries that are listed up in the screen. And what is really interesting is this coalescing effect that we see here. First, that ASEAN, more than 50% of ASEAN countries, these 6 ASEAN countries, actually see ASEAN as most influential region-wide across Southeast Asia. And then we ask the next question, how about influence in the country that you're in, the country that you work in? And look at that, it is still ASEAN, okay? With some exceptions, you have, you can see the Philippines choosing the US, and in Singapore and Thailand, you see China there. But ASEAN is still overall the one that has the most votes. Now, what is even more interesting for me, and I think maybe for Amitav too, because this is about ASEAN collective identity. Overwhelmingly, more than 80% of the 6 Southeast Asian states that the elites of these countries that we surveyed, more than 80% says they collectively identify with ASEAN. All of them. All of them. And China is a very far second, and the US even further down. Now, so this is just three tables that I draw from this paper that's forthcoming. If anyone's interested in this paper, I'm very, very happy to send you the paper for your reference and for your usage. Now, let me just conclude, because I think my time is up, is that the longer-term prognosis for the region is really very uncertain in these 3 aspects that I was talking about, the security order, right? Now, the region does better in upholding trade and economy architecture. I mean, by the sheer numbers of presentations on economy and things that we are doing in trying to hold up the global supply chains and, looking at what's happening with FDI, trade and all sorts of things. The region has traditionally been historically been very, very good in upholding trade and economy architecture. I think that we will do better in this area. The track record for us on socializing major powers has also been great, but I think what we need to do is really to maintain ASEAN unity. I think when ASEAN stands together, then we can have the ability to socialize the major powers. And as an honest broker, and as Danny was saying yesterday, nudging the major powers to behave themselves. But ASEAN faces really long struggles, and these struggles have been ongoing since its formation, I would say. It struggled with fractures resulting from pressures from within. This is primarily referring to Myanmar, and then from the US and China when it comes to the South China Sea. And this is where the greatest risks for us all are. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. We now have the economic and the security landscape in our foreground. So let's now dive into Vietnam to see, how Vietnam as a country is navigating in this landscape. Okay. The floor is yours, Tan.
Thank you. There's been a fair number of mentionings of Vietnam since yesterday morning. So I'll start. I think I lost the first slide. But anyway, so I start with the current strategy. The de-risking strategy of Vietnam in the last 10 years. So basically, being neutral is the de-risking strategy. But with a new change in leadership at Vietnam this year, won't there be any changes in that policy? And there are, of course, 2 possible directions. One is that the new leadership will see that not choosing side will be unsustainable in the future. So now they have to make some movements, either moving toward China or the US. And my argument is that that will not happen, right? For 2 reasons. I think one is, of course, is the high level of consensus of the painful lesson for Vietnam in the past, right? About choosing side. Anytime Vietnam chooses a side, it gets a devastating war, right? And most recently is the also a hard lesson from the Russia-Ukraine war, right? So Vietnam look at China and see the threat if it move toward the US, or it look at the US and say, if we move toward the US, right, then it may lose the party-to-party relationship with China, right, and the survival of the Vietnamese Communist Party, right, the CPV. So the other direction, of course, is not choosing side. But then there are two scenarios here. One is moving toward more independence and strategic autonomy, right? And I think you will see in the couple of months, I mean, new policies spelled out by the new leadership on the surface about that direction. But my argument is that in reality, I think Vietnam will pursue a new industrial policy that will make it even more dependent economically on both China and the US, right? So the leadership will see that actually the priority for Vietnam is still fast economic growth, right? And they will pursue a high risk, high reward policy, remaining neutral, but being more dependent on both sides, right? And that's because on the surface, I mean, like, so they will be celebrating 40 years of the economic open policy next year, right? And most of them will have the, like, I mean, on the surface, they will try to send a message to the Vietnamese public. This is the glass half, I call it glass half full, right? We are always the second fastest economic growth in the last 30 years. But internally, right, there are increasingly voices about the danger of falling into a middle income trap, right? So they look at other peers, both in Northeast and Southeast Asia, right? All economies, right, the so-called Asian tigers, right, managed very fast economic growth. Some for a short period of time, like 15, 20 years, other much longer, 20 to 30 years. And Vietnam actually grew fast, but actually significantly slower than others, right, during the past. And actually it was a conscious decision, part of the de-risking strategy, right? We grew fast, but not too fast, right? But now there is discontent politically that that strategy will not get Vietnam out of the middle income trap, right? 6% or below 6%, right, will make Vietnam, I think, grow old before getting rich. And that means with that scenario, the CPV may not survive, given the increasing social pressure, right? So we need to grow fast. But in the past, it was very successful with globalization, right? So export-oriented manufacturing, right? FDI, fueled by FDI and domestic private sector. But now they know that, okay, 6.5 to 7% is very difficult in the anti-globalization sentiment, right? And also pressure from China. So the Vietnamese leadership's current view, right, on the global regional environment, right? So they saw some dangers of a hot war, still the possibility of happening, right? They believe, but they still believe that that's a very, very tiny chance. And also they believe not in decoupling. So the US and China, like we mentioned many times already, but the de-risking, right? And they do share Professor Tony Sich view, maybe because all the senior members of the Politburo of Vietnam in the last 15 years had spent some time at the Kennedy School listening to Tony. Right? So they believe and very happy with increasing US presence for security. Right? So Vietnam will not enter into any security alliances, but are very happy for the US to be more aggressive in strengthening its own security alliances with Asian partners. They also believe that China will dominate the regional supply chains, and Vietnam will cooperate with China, right? We're happy to implement RCEP, right? So far, Skippy talked about BRI member state yesterday. Vietnam is a BRI country, but so far there's no single BRI project in Vietnam. And China is pushing Vietnam very, very hard, right? Right. And Vietnam will, I think, give in. There won't be BRI projects in Vietnam, right? Maybe happening very fast in the next 2 to 3 years. So my view is that, so responding to these geopolitical challenges, so I'm mentioning these already. So in terms of defense, right, maintaining the current neutral stance, meaning they continue the four no's policy, right, in defense and security. But then there's one if, right? So Vietnam is telling China, right, don't push us too hard on the South China Sea, right? We will not enter into alliance with the West to contain China. But if you push us too hard in the South China Sea, then we have no choice to abandon that policy. And Vietnam is telling the US, including Donald Trump, don't push us too hard, right, on the trade front, and also on the, so that, and also to the Democrats on the human rights front. If you do that, then we have no choice, right? Otherwise, we will implement with the US the recent upgrade in relationship to comprehensive strategic. So the US in the last 10 years has been pushing Vietnam very hard to upgrade relations. And Vietnam resisted until last year with the Biden's visit that Vietnam announced finally that the two countries, the two former enemies, will upgrade the relationship to comprehensive strategic. Yes. And at the same time, just a month after that, with the visit of Xi Jinping to Hanoi, Vietnam announced that it would join China's community of shared future. Right? That was a demand from President Xi Jinping also during his, starting from his second term and intensified during his third term. And Vietnam resisted also until last year. Right. Right. So my argument now is that the new leadership will look at these two as the done deal, right? So either they will make it, those two arrangements, nominal, right, to preserve Vietnam neutral policy, but my argument is that they will actually deepen that, right? The strategic, comprehensive, meaning that using that to make sure that, right, whether you have a Republican president or a Democrat president, right, they will spare Vietnam on the trade front, right, in return for some strategic partnership. On China, right, Vietnam will make sure that joining the shared future, meaning that Vietnam will make no political reform, right, will keep the close party-to-party relationship, right, and at some level join the BRI initiative from China, right. So with that, what they want from that, this new industrial policy, is to say that we will be deeply integrated with the regional supply chains, with both the US and China. And their interpretation of friendshoring, Vietnam's interpretation of friendshoring, is that we are the friendly place for doing business for both the US and China and other economic partners, including the EU and other Asian countries, right? So they announced, I think they already to some level, but with the next party congress in early 2006, they will announce the new industrial policy, of course focusing on the digital economy, semiconductor, and green energy, right? But this is, so in the past, Vietnam traditional industrial policy have been massive and generous subsidies to FDI companies and also state-owned and domestic enterprises, right? In terms of fiscal incentives, land, right? And also even energy prices, right? But the new industrial policy will be saying no to these subsidies, right? Because of the need for growth faster, and the fiscal situation is that Vietnam cannot afford to compete with others in providing subsidies, right, for investment, for FDI, and for state-owned and local private businesses. Also painful lessons from the past about corruption and failures of picking local champions and domestic winners. So the new industrial policy, even they announced that will be aimed toward economic resiliency, but still depending on deeper integration with both the US and China, right? Right. So the competitive advantage for Vietnam will not be the government offering generous incentives and subsidies for investment, but by being a friendly place, by take the risk of being more dependent on both China, right? You will see increasing imports from China. So this year, I think my colleague mentioning, right, all ASEAN countries face 30 to 40% rise in imports from China, right? All countries except Vietnam instituted temporary barriers. Vietnam said no, right? They said that it fully implement RCEP, telling China that no barriers, right? Tariff or technical barriers, and making sure that that's not a short-term but a long-term commitment, and to ensure free trade between China and Vietnam, right? So with the US is telling the US, okay, you worried about the trade deficit. I think Vietnam is the third largest country that has a trade surplus with the US, just after China and Mexico. And Vietnam is telling both Harris and Trump that it will continue to rise, right? Because Vietnam will continue to import components and intermediate goods from Asia for final exports to North America and the EU. And that's structural. It's not because of currency manipulation. So we make sure that there's no transshipment issues, but any economic arrangements with the US will be actively participating, right? We face the risk of Trump wrath if he becomes president and impose some punitive tariff on Vietnam. But if you do that, U.S. will sacrifice some strategic partnership. So that's, I think, is my argument that Vietnam coming strategy, of course, on the surface will being neutral, but pursue policies that make Vietnam even more dependent economically, but keep the economies open, right? Becoming a friendly place for investment. And the focus will be on faster economic growth and maybe reduce the risk of getting into the middle income trap. Thank you. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Tang. We now calling on the three discussants. First one, Amita Acharya from American U as well as TSE. The second, Philip Xu from NTU, National Taiwan University. And the third one, Tony Sage from the Harvard Kennedy School, in that alphabetical order, please.
Thank you. Thank you, TJ, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope we'll get our students to talk at this session. So let me just give a one-line summary of the three papers before I turn to this. Professor Suthipan, the key takeaway I got from that is that because of the US-ASEAN, so US-China trade war, and of course the geopolitical rivalry, which is also centered on US and China, there's major economic implications for ASEAN. But, and if I got him right, ASEAN has short-term gain, but maybe that turn into long-term pain. So the gains are short-term. We saw a lot of data about how the supply chain diversification, the trade war, decoupling, de-risking is actually helping countries like Vietnam, like Thailand, and ASEAN in general. But he says it may not last. I actually see that we don't know whether it won't last. This is an opportunity for ASEAN. And also, it's not just because of the decoupling and de-risking, it's also because China's slowed down in Chinese economic growth. So it could well be that we see that we do actually see at the global level, everything that's happening today is a short-term crisis, but I think in the long term it's good for the world. My argument in this book is the decline of the West may cause crisis in the short term. In the long term, it's actually good for world order. And that leads me to a point that came out of, also from Dr. Suthipan's paper, but generally from the panel, that the last thing the world needs is the decline of the American world order leading to a China-led world order. I remember what you said yesterday, the third nations. We need actually a third nations world order. That's not going to happen if either US or China is leading. So we need a third way, and that is actually, this is the moment that could happen. And this could actually happen in East Asia first, or Southeast Asia, East Asia first. Selena's paper is really on the point, and really everybody should pay attention to that table of perceptions of who is the most important actor. Why is that important? I live in Washington. I created the first ASEAN Center in the United States in 2010 with the help of the US State Department and Surin Pitsuwan, the former Secretary General of ASEAN. Now, in the US, now the US government has created a US ASEAN Center just last year. But they're kind of following us. But the most important thing I find in the US is that this is always constant drone of ASEAN is losing its centrality, ASEAN way is gone, ASEAN is finished. Where are they getting this idea? They're not getting this idea from people like Selena Ho, because most of the people in the region still identify with ASEAN. Now that doesn't mean ASEAN can solve everything, but identity is a big thing. It's not like they're jumping into the Western identity, the liberal order. So if you want to really have a meaningful policy towards Asia or ASEAN, you should understand that this is a very important deal for Southeast Asian people and countries. And so the perception gap that the constant drone of disappointment that ASEAN is not doing things, ASEAN is lost, ASEAN is finished, doesn't really bear out. And Selena's paper also talks about the importance of regionalism in this. People call it a fragmented world. I call it a pluralized world, because there are more actors, and regional organizations play a very important role. So where you see pessimism, I actually see a lot of optimism in the medium to long term. And finally, Dr. Tan, your paper is very clear, and the clear message is, again, reinforcing the idea that we have known for a while that ASEAN is not going to take sides. Even Vietnam, which is geopolitically right next to China, very vulnerable, is going to actually stand stand its ground. And that's actually also a good thing, because it means that you would not end up having a Chinese-led world order as a result of the decline of the US-led world order. So we'll lead a pluralistic one, we'll have a pluralistic one, we'll have what I call a multiplex one, and again, I don't have time to go into all this, but my key point is that because of the changes, the new global landscape with this 4 major points that I identified, 4 major elements, but the major strategy for nations everywhere, including small and weaker nations, would be to engage everybody. I don't like hedging, it's a negative word, like hiding, engagement. So Vietnam is engaging both China and US. ASEAN is engaging both China and the US. So multi-engagement. Open regionalism is a good strategy that Professor Suthipan pointed out. It was invented in this region. And open regionalism means the risk of fragmentation is actually low. Regional organizations are not going to just become like 19th century trade blocs. Then we should have a cognitive shift, meaning try to not accept what we get here from Western academics or media, that now Southeast Asia is finished, ASEAN is finished, the world is collapsing. Actually, there is a lot of good news. What I call Joseph Schumpeter's term, creative destruction. That's what is happening.
Thank you, Amita. We now go to Phillips.
Thank you, DJ. Let me thank the invitation by the TSE Foundation as well as the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel, and it's a pleasure to read Professor Ho's paper. I've learned a lot from this. Originally, I was assigned to comment on Professor Gou's and Professor Ho's papers, but since Professor Gou is not here, so I'm just going to comment on Professor Ho's paper. So my comment may tend to be brief, I guess. Let me start, I'm going to make several points. Let me start with the point of a key argument or key concept that Professor Ho mentions in her paper, which is the US and Chinese expansion or pursuit of sphere of influence in Southeast Asia, okay? And I pretty much agree with that. In recent years, as both great powers seek to engage in more aggressive attempt to pursue their sphere of influence, that's a major cause for the strategic instability as well as uncertainty for Asian centrality and unity in recent years. However, I would probably add the point that the pursuit of sphere of influence did not really begin in recent years when the bilateral strategic competition intensifies. For example, if we look at the era of President Obama, right? Obama came up with the sort of pivot to Asia strategy, where the so-called air and sea warfare was a major component. And with regard to that initiative, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia were included, okay? That was an undeniable aggressive attempt, to say the least, to consolidate the US sort of hub and spoke system in the region, and implicitly trying to contain potential increasing Chinese strategic influence in the region, right? And with regard to Chinese expansion before the recent years, when we talk about the BRI project, which we know began with the Xi Jinping era, however, we also know that, especially in Southeast Asia, many of the BRI projects are actually based on the already pre-existing infrastructure projects launched during the Hu Jintao era, especially on the maritime Southeast Asia, right? Okay, so this brings me to my second point, which is that it's actually the sort of the rapidly rising aggressiveness for the expansion of sphere influence from both great powers that make the rival perceive that there's an imminent crisis for its vital interests in this region, or maybe even globally, that leads to this intensified strategic competition and brings about the strategic instability that Professor Ho talks about. For example, we know that during the Xi Jinping era, one of the major sort of destabilizing acts in view of ASEAN countries is really the artificial islands as well as the power projection of China in South China Sea. And also, as Professor Ho points out, that the much expanded BRI projects rapidly increase the level of dependence of these countries on China, in addition to their increased volume of trade investment with China. And on part of the U.S., of course, is the sort of sense of crisis of the U.S. leadership, beginning with the President Trump, that prompted the U.S. to engage in not only trade and technological warfare with China, but also the strengthening of its hub and spoke alliance system, exemplified by a lot of things such as AUKUS and its strengthened partnership with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam in the region. Okay, so this brings me to the next point, which is relevant to a very important argument made in this concept, which is the Asian centrality, unity, and identity. Okay, reading throughout the paper, readers got the impression that Asian centrality unity is really facing, at least, to say the least, a short-term crisis, right? But if we take seriously my two foregoing points, isn't it true that Asian centrality and unity has always been a function of great power, capability, and intention, instead of focusing on the specific, stable, unchanging level of Asian centrality and concept? So by adopting such a more flexible approach, which in my view, I hope would be an attempt to sort of salvage or enliven the relevance of Asian centrality rather than denying it. With this more flexible approach, wouldn't it make more sense for us to have some sort of new insight into the viability of ASEAN centrality and unity in the near future? Okay. For example, we know that ASEAN, one of the major background factors when ASEAN first was ushered in was the ending of the Vietnam War, right? So ever since the ending of the Vietnam War, up until recently, there has been no intensified or serious great power competition in the region, right? Okay, so that is a major sort of facilitating condition for the expansion and sustainability of ASEAN centrality and unity, right? So if we say that, and we know that one of the major motivations for these countries to come into ASEAN is because they don't want to be dragged into unwanted, especially military conflict in the region between great powers. So if we define that as the minimal condition, or the minimal sort of threshold that cannot be violated for maintaining ASEAN centrality and unity, then this has basically been left intact as of now. Okay, so by thinking that way, by moving along this more flexible sort of a conception or approach for defining or assessing the sustainability of ASEAN centrality and unity, I think that would probably enable us to have a more sort of a rosy prospect for the level or the possibility to maintain the relevance of ASEAN. Okay. The next point, after saying that, the next point is a theoretical sort of suggestion, which is about constructivism's concept of socialization. Of course, we have Professor Acharya as the most important scholar in this regard. So my thinking along this line is that, when before the intensified competition between U.S. and China began in recent years, there has been indeed a long period of successful socialization by ASEAN of both U.S. and China, to facilitate the redefinition of their identities and interests, right? But again, that's probably a function of great power intention capability. The main sort of thinking I'm trying to come up with is that we could sort of ask, is socialization process a irreversible process or not? Okay, it may be irreversible, which I don't think is a concept ever being seriously discussed in the field, in the realm or in the sphere of constructivism, okay? Apparently, that's probably the case in recent years. But if that's the case, then we should not exclude the possibility of both powers returning to previous redefinition of their identity interests, trying to move closer to the so-called Kantian rather than the Hobbesian Asian security order. That's also a possibility, okay? The last one is a minor thought, okay? We talk about ASEAN centrality and unity, but we also know that for these countries to deal with the two great powers, there has been long discussed sort of practice of hedging by many, if not most, of these ASEAN states, okay? Isn't there supposedly some sort of inherent intentions between individual countries' hedging strategy, which would be pretty much inconsistent with the national interest and the collective identity and collective interest and collective unity of ASEAN centrality? We should probably think about that, okay? I think this is probably another possible sort of, revenue for research in the future. So thank you for your attention.
I mean, these are three great presentations, and I learned a lot from them. I think all three of them show, of course, how China's rising influence is changing the traditional underpinning of the East Asian security order. And it also shows what we've talked about on a number of occasions, the division between the economic and the security aspects. So Selina notes, for example, that while the Global Development Initiative is enthusiastically embraced, the Global Security Initiative is kept at arm's length. And of course, for China's part, it welcomes regional trade initiatives, but it shuns any regional security initiatives that might restrain its actions. Xuan Tan provided a very sophisticated view, I thought, of Vietnam strategy. I hope the new leadership is as smart as Xuan Tan is in pursuing that. There's a couple of things I just wanted to ask. If you could talk a little bit more about what is the root of the bamboo diplomacy? I mean, I love the phrase, but it needs to think about the soil in which it's rooted. The second thing is, when you talked about the industrial policy moving forward, it seems to me that all three of those aspects are going to be very difficult for Vietnam to achieve. And if they are difficult, what does that do? The other comments I'd like to make are sort of broader in the sense that lurking behind all the papers, and I would say most of the papers that we've been presented with, is how China's policy has been evolving. But we've not been very specific about that. So I'd like to conclude by making 3 points quickly about China's approach that's impacting on Asia and even beyond. The first, of course, is the securitization of the economy. And Xi Jinping has made it very clear that in his view, this is the foundation of development. In fact, the securitization began much earlier than Xi Jinping's rule. If one looks at 2008, for example, China banned Facebook and Google, explicitly citing that it was on security concerns. So the US now talking about TikTok had been preceded by a good decade or more by Chinese actions. So that means that China's been preparing for some time to protect itself against what it sees as an increasing pressure from the US, Europe, and its allies in the Asia region. And now we're seeing these tit-for-tat measures between Washington and Beijing. So my second and third point is, first, the securitization of the economy. The second is to counter the perceived threats. China is producing two forms of risk mitigation strategies. The first is geoeconomic, and the second is geopolitical. I think if we look at the economic realm, the Chinese leadership has sought to protect itself by becoming less reliant on global economy while stimulating the development of its domestic capabilities, what it calls dual circulation. It's increased its investment in indigenous technological innovation, which it sees as crucial to national power. And that's, of course, incorporated in Made in China 2025. So the Chinese leadership clearly see global power as closely associated with those countries that set standards for the advanced technologies for the present and into the future. And it will use the Belt and Road Initiative to export those technologies to tie other countries into a Chinese-dominated set of systems. And despite the continued high level of trade between China and the US, China is seeking to diversify, as we've seen from the various presentations, while using that trade and investment clout to push other countries to support its broader ambitions. This comes over very clearly in Selina's presentation of fragmentation within ASEAN. The last point then is the CCP's geopolitical risk mitigation, which I would say is twofold. The first is to strengthen relations with those countries that reject the domination of the US in the global order. Of course, that lies behind the tightening of relations with Russia. And while there might not be a strong throng rallying behind China and Russia to build a new global order, except for perhaps Iran and North Korea, I do think there is wide support for a multipolar world where the US and Western influence is moderated by other voices. I think this has been it's very much the case for countries in the South. And I think it's interesting to look at the evolution of BRICS within this framework, where Russia and China have found some support for the notion of a multipolar world, although of course it's not the same as the New World Order led by China and Russia. So at the June 2023 meeting of the foreign ministers of BRICS, the BRICS called for a rebalancing of the global order that accepted a multipolar world, claiming that this would be beneficial to the needs of developing countries, maybe along the lines of what Amitav is talking about. Second part of the geopolitical is the expansion of influence in global institutions, especially in those that China feels do not reflect its values and outlooks, or where it sees the US as withdrawing. China, not surprisingly, like other great powers, views international agencies as a way to assert its values, thus causing it to seek a leadership role. And I think one needs to look very specially at agencies that deal with crucial questions of setting standards in the fields of telecoms, aviation, and agriculture, where China has been boosting its representation and leadership roles. It has already led a number of related UN specialized agencies, and it's also been boosting its influence in other standard-setting organizations, such as the International Organization for Standardization and the International Electrotechnical Commission. So I think these three approaches from China, combined with the securitization of policy in the United States, which we have talked about a little bit more, I think are what pressing nations in the region and are making navigation much more difficult for those countries.
Thank you. So now we move on to a Q&A period. I would like to suggest that we collect as many questions as possible. Instead of going sort of one-on-one sort of the dialogue here. So the floor is open, and keywords here, of course, engagement and openness. Yeah, I see three hands already, Yves and Professor Lee, and student back there. Yeah, okay, one there. Let's go to this side first, and then we'll come back there. Okay, Yves first. Okay, great, yeah. Yes, please, yeah, go ahead, TSC students, yeah.
I actually have two questions. So, given the U.S. CHIPS Act's goal to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing and diversify its supply chain, so how will the inclusion of the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia in the CHIPS Act, particularly in the ITSI fund, affect the ASEAN principle on neutrality in terms of geopolitical matters? And my second question is, how might the participation of these countries influence U.S. geostrategy in the region, especially in the context of competition with China?
Thank you, Elliot, for your sort of a double-barrel questions. Any other questions from TSC students, particularly back there? Okay, so we'll turn back to you. Yeah, Yves, and then Professor Lee, and then, yes, go ahead, Yves.
Okay, I speak loud enough there. Actually, quick question for particularly Xuan Tan. The Russia story, Putin's visit, is that a way to counter-edge both China and the US? Both were pretty upset, actually. How does it fit in the strategy? And then actually a bigger question for several in the panel is like we have all those models about strategies by US, by China, etc. How do we make sense of the strategy in the South China Sea, this aggressive confrontation? It seems to backfire, just like with India. It keeps organizing people against China. So how can they be so strategic on the geoeconomics and apparently so incompetent or organize coalition against them with the South China Sea confrontation? So how do we make sense from a causality perspective?
Professor Lee?
Thank you very much. Well, over the couple of days today, I realized that we are talking about Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia here. But if I just go to the US or Japan or even in my country, Korea, we no longer talk about Asia, East Asia much. We are more focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. But I think I haven't heard about anything related to the Indo-Pacific security in here. So I was wondering, as a particular from our ASEAN fellows, what do you think about the region term the Indo-Pacific? Does it matter here as well? And another thing is, one missing here is the voice from Japan. Although I don't representing for the Japan, what do you think about the role of the Northeast Asians to make ASEAN having a bit more stronger voices in terms of the security and the trade issues?
Professor Schiphol and then Professor Hill in that order. And
thank you very much. Excellent presentations. I particularly liked Xuan Tan's. I wonder whether he's almost advocating this is the model for every country, but the large powers in the sense of trying to find that balance. It was immediately remind me of Germany. I think I could have changed Vietnam to Germany with the exception of the party to party, but it's exactly what Germany, I think, intends to do. The problem, I think, with that is from either side, it only is effective if you have assets that you can sell. Vietnam, maybe by extension Germany have that, but there are many others that don't have the strategic relevance, and therefore it would be very, very difficult to play the same game. So that is one of my questions. The second one is, if that's true, then ASEAN is almost irrelevant because every country will just trying to find that little balance using its assets on either side. The ones that are weaker get less and the ones that are stronger can potentially maintain that independence. So very much concerned about ASEAN. And the last part also that Tony, I think, mentioned, I think we're underestimating the challenge that comes now from the setting of standards, global standards, whether it's AI, or whether it is even in EV technology, where I don't think it will be possible to have a neutral position. At the end of the day, the country will have to choose one standard over the other. So that is my question, whether the model really is possible if these standards, especially on data transfer and then related to services, are being imposed. And I think this is why China now is extremely aggressive through the BRI to ensure that its standards are adopted globally. So again, bad news for the ability to really find that middle ground that, for example, Vietnam is trying to pursue.
Professor Hill and Professor Chen, you are next.
Thanks to the three speakers for terrific presentations. I had a question, related question for the first and third speakers, which is about, I guess, the kind of stickiness of change which is being described. So firstly, on inward FDI into ASEAN and the rise in inward FDI into ASEAN relative to China. First, extraordinary numbers. So thank you for presenting those. I had not seen that before. Really extraordinary. Yesterday, we learned quite a bit about the solar PV sector in Malaysia. And one of the key points I think you could take away from yesterday's presentation is how in that particular sector there's a lot of integration of first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers, different levels of integration across the value chain, which means that the FDI that's gone in is likely to be really sticky over time, right? It's something that you build up over time, and pulling it apart is difficult, right? That looks quite different to products which are more standardized. If you think about textiles or something more simple like this, I could imagine that trend that you identified changing again quite easily in areas in which you have less integration between different parts of the value chain. So I wondered if you could say something about how sticky you think that change is, maybe as a function of the different sectors into which that FDI is going within ASEAN. I'm just interested in understanding if you think that's a long-term trend, that is an autocorrelation, if you like, right? What happened in T-1 is going to tell you a lot about what happens in T or T+1 or T+2. And similar question with Vietnam, really interested to hear about BRI and the potential involvement of Vietnam within BRI. Projects take on many different characteristics. Some of them, for example, are port-related. Some are rail-related or road-related. Others are not of that kind. But of course, port and particularly rail and road-related BRI projects create interdependencies which are much longer term, right? You're going to see more movement of goods and more movements of people as a function of building a road across borders. So could you say something about what the likely type of BRI project that might be, the Vietnamese government might be considering taking on board? Thank you.
Professor Chan.
Thank you very much. I have got a simple question, which is today we have a very good paper on Vietnam. The thrust of the paper is that it is playing a very fine balancing act between China and the US in the bilateral tensions there. And yesterday, we have a paper on the Philippines, which is also examining the bilateral relations between China and the US, but it's tilting much more towards the US for various reasons and conditions. So I'm just wondering whether this kind of difference, different paths in this tensions relationship will impact on ASEAN's unity. Thank you.
Do I see any more hands at this point? Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My question is, so is China's challenge within the ASEAN only limited to economic and the military spheres, or do you think that China also seeks to exert its cultural and leadership influence within the region? And just to add to that, do you think that China does want to play or sort of take over the soft power big brother role that the US has been playing in the region, or are they just only interested in the economic part of things? Thank you.
Yes, please, Danny.
Thank you. There's so many questions. I don't know how the panel's going to have time. But can I just invite the panel to clarify exactly the nature of the economic challenge that either US-China rivalry brings or China's rise brings? I have heard valid statements from different parts of the panel. Anthony Sage talked about China's pulling back protection, so pulling back from being so dependent on the world. But at the same time, I've also heard Professor Sutee talking about China's overcapacity China's bilateral trade surplus. And it seems to me that these two are inconsistent. We need to choose one. China can't be damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. It can't be pulling back and then therefore hurting others, and it can't be going out and hurting others. You've got to pick a side. So along that same front, I see that there are indeed great dangers from US-China rivalry. Geopolitically driven friendshoring, so inefficient rewiring of the supply chain. But I don't see this as being something that's specifically coming from just China or from just the United States. It's coming from the rivalry itself. So when we say China's rise is threatening economically, I as an economist, I don't know what that means. I would like some greater clarity on that. And then finally, I'm very sensitive to what Anthony Sage and my friend Alfred Schipke have said about standards, China's competition for standards. But that is a problem due to our need for there being one standard. It's not a problem because of US-China rivalry. Even if there weren't US-China rivalry, it would still be a problem that one side wants to have its standards imposed on everyone else. So I would like just greater clarity as we discuss US-China rivalry and China's rise, just so I am sure who I should blame for what. Thank you.
Don't blame anyone. Okay, I think we have a good battery of questions to address. So I'm going to give priority to three presenters, each 5 minutes at least, and then perhaps additional 5 minutes, for any discussions to jump in if they like to do it. Professors, Thiwa first. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, I hope they do the justice to so many comments. I think it's very useful comments again. Maybe I start from the end and up to, from Danny and up to Professor Amitav, one of the discussion. I think is to take the Danny comments about the, that we've been seeing China rise right before all these years of up to the pandemic COVID. And then from whatever 2018, and we start to discuss about the rivalry. So this, this is, on hand in hand, we're still looking at the China rise voice. The way we're talking is different. I think once you add up, I think this, that question of rivalry. So to mix the two, it's true that maybe my paper also try to have the mixed message, but I think this is very much, as I point from the beginning, is interrelated, and we cannot take one or another. Let's say we can say China rivalry, but at the same time, with China rise, whether it's China rise because now the China in trouble as well as home. For what we call the question of excess supply. I use the word excess supply because of the domestic downturn since the COVID that we can see. And this is a contentious point that of also on one part because of rivalry, the ASEAN as a case, there have been diversion of trade and investment to ASEAN. So for non-Chinese firms, that's clear. US, European, and others from East Asia. But as well as a Chinese firm, they start to divert the risk, the business. You go more to take the business side. So this is a kind of diversion to ASEAN. And on the other hand, underpinning, as we discussed, overcapacity, and in ASEAN we cannot neglect that China also, because of I say that we have for years, that open border, both sides, both for good services also, and you can see very well for people. So in that regard, I think it's important to look at also that, how that kind of is not quite the kind of the China rise, but also China in difficulties of at home, and then China needs something to export to gain more exchange rate. I mean, to gain more what you call foreign exchange, and to help the economic back home. So I think this is perhaps this mixed message can be interpreted later on how ASEAN would like to devise in terms of strategy on supply chain. We're talking about de-risking. On excess supply, there might be some kind of other, another set of strategy that we're talking more in our region. So I hope it's, I cannot be clear yet, but I think we need to do that kind of homework. Very quickly back to Professor Hughes. I think it's very important I think it's important to look at it through that. When I point out about the rise of the FDI, of course, there are a lot of the things that we need to examine. I mean, those kind of existing or supplementing, I mean, with new investment. And I said that we have yet to look into it. That if you look into like a case of the Chinese investment into, you mentioned about the, I think Alfred as well mentioned, like Chinese EV into ASEAN, for example, is taking the EV industry. So we have already few Chinese players who like to be in domestic market, and from Thailand to Indonesia, it's a big market, and in Malaysia, Vietnam, all that, So they're quite big player in this, and I believe that it will, I mean, for the moment, it will continue. But the EV case may be not a good case because of being protected, and I don't think this Chinese EV car will be also exportable region to maybe to other market, but not to Western market like EU, or the EU already have the Chinese, the latest case of Europe just passed the so-called the new restriction to those that you show very well yesterday. I think you show, right, your slide. So I think the EU is another case. But there are also so many other cases, and to Chandran, Sola, and to your paper about on energy, I think this is another green tech and industry that's also been given a lot of attention in ASEAN, and I think it's important to look at that. But ASEAN also already have the kind of energy mix and energy transition as much as many other regions of the world. We need to be more sustainable region, and also in our manufacturing and services that using more kind of the energy mix that keep changing to be more sustainable or more resilient. So I think is the case of the solar is also quite a case. It's true that you said that it's been developing not only Malaysia, in Thailand, Vietnam, and many ASEAN countries. Also the case of, I mean, this industry being developed, and I think there's both a model, both it's a new technology and a new player. So both, I think, is we cannot negate that one part is a big player is also in China, and if you taking the case about our export, not only the for domestic market, ASEAN is the 4 ASEAN countries. In fact, if you include also Cambodia, from Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, we export 75%, I mean, of the U.S. market share. That's of solar roof. Is important of 3/4 coming from ASEAN. And I think it's there both sides. I mean, that's whether it's a Chinese technology, whether there's a non-Chinese firm moving in. I think there's quite a mixed picture that now also another area that we need to working more. I will not have time as a chair already look at it about the EU, whether the standard we can, this is the big question also, of course. It could be next important thing that will happen if you think about like, we talk in terms of data center, we talk in terms of AI, we talk in terms of players like Huawei and Google and all that, you know. So this is whether it come to the point about the standard. I mean, even in our region, which one is more, you know, that's the attitude of ASEAN and we advocate all along is not choosing side, but then again, it will be difficult. I mean, for the private players to choose, and then the government who look into that kind of regulation to work both in hand, whether they will be subject to some kind of, you know, that retaliation or something, you know, that might coming up. I will not have time to go into that. So lastly, on the maybe back to Professor Amitav. True, the question is about the short-term gain is there, long-term risks and opportunities still unclear. Of course, we have to work on it. But I think it's, if you look in terms of again about this round of investment, we have to make, first of all, ASEAN most efficient in terms of, you know, as a grouping to be as precise again, the least trade diversion and the most trade creation as a grouping. And ASEAN this round have again that opportunity. And they're also related to about the agglomerated production networks that we need to, the chance to be upstream, you know, the upstream, not only saying downstream. But ASEAN again is not technology holders like Taiwan, Korea, Japan. So we have to work hard, you know, in terms of R&D and develop our talent, people, the poor people, you know. But again, it's we are in terms of a good economic landscape that's been open to us, and of course, even with India is good, but India also have the restriction, you know, a lot of restriction in terms of the institution that may be that also connected to ASEAN in some way, and then this is also the area of ASEAN India that we've been working in terms of how to devise the opportunities and the minimizing our risk. I think that I will stop here. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Serena?
Many questions, so I'm just going to try and lump them all together, not all lump them all together, but lump them into three broad questions, and maybe also reflect on some of the comments that the discussants have said. Maybe I'll start with ASEAN. I mean, just to say that there are several questions about bilateral strategies and how that may cause irrelevance for ASEAN. And, you know, with the Philippines on being closer to the US and Thailand being closer to China, actually the results that I showed for my survey actually portrayed that very exactly, that kind of influence on the two countries. But I think that's precisely the challenge that ASEAN is facing, which is that there is a spectrum of views. 10 countries, you're not going to find the same views, same interests, same anything about China and India. Everyone is going to come from a national interest. And there will be bilateral strategies that are being used to cope with the two superpowers, but not to say that just because, you know, you have individual strategies, it doesn't mean that ASEAN becomes irrelevant. It is not mutually exclusive to engage in bilateral strategies and in multilateral strategies. They are all valid strategies. And, you know, China's policy towards the region. So the other thing is to say that there was a question about China's challenge in economic and security spheres. How about cultural influence? That is definitely true. There was a student who asked that, right?
Right.
Which student was that? Is he at the back? The student at the back. Yeah. So you asked about cultural influence. I'll be happy to send you some things that are written about the kind of influence that China has, and that includes the paper I was referring to that's going to come out. Cultural influence is definitely a global civilization initiative, the community of shared destiny. I think that China definitely wants to promote the idea of it being, there's a cultural renaissance in China, and that also projects outwards. So the idea of, many different types of civilizations, but underlying this many types of civilization is actually the idea that culturally China has a form of civilization that is culturally superior, in a sense that, by morality, not by using hard power, but using soft power, but influencing through culture. And I think there's that part of it. And ASEAN is very cautious about it. And that's why my friend here was saying about Vietnam, being one of the last countries to join this community of shared destiny. There is a civilizational aspect to it. China as the culture center of the region. I think there is that part of it. But China's policies, whether economic policies and security policies are contradictory, which is EU's statements, I think you shouldn't see that as mutually exclusive, because economic inducements is one strategy. It is about inducing a certain set of behavior, tying the region closer to China, right? And that's what the region wants from China, economics, that's what we want, that's how we benefit, right? But security, the coalition that you see, that you refer to, the clashes with India and the clashes in the South China Sea, that is a coercive strategy. So coercion and inducement do work hand in hand. So there's attraction. These are all multiple strategies that countries use. So it's not, again, mutually exclusive that you see such things happening. I mean, what does China want from Southeast Asia? China wants a stable border for it to grow economically. It also sees the region's growth as beneficial for its own security. But it also wants its territorial integrity, territorial claims to be recognized and accepted. And they always see a US hand behind these territorial issues. They see the US as fomenting and encouraging India on the border issue, and sees the US as encouraging the Philippines in the border issue. I went for a meeting in Beijing in the spring. It was very clear when they talk about the Philippines and China's South China Sea, what's going on there. They see the US as prodding and encouraging the Philippines to take those actions. It was very, very clear. Because they referred to, when they talk about the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sabina Shoal, they refer to an gentleman's agreement. Those are the exact words. Gentleman's agreement between Rodrigo Duterte and the Chinese side that they will, I can't remember exactly what was the agreement, but the agreement was that they were going to settle this shoal business properly. But then the government changed, and then you see this under Marcos Jr., you see them taking a more activist reaction to what the Chinese is doing. So that to them was that this was the US behind it. Okay, so this is how they see the region. So you can expect, because of that, China will react with much more coercive measures because they see the US hand behind it. Now, wait, let me see, what's the next one? Chinese policies, Asian security. Professor Lee's questions about Indo-Pacific. The region uses the term Indo-Pacific as and when they depend on who they speak to. And if you're asking about whether there's a possibility of Asian NATO, I would say zilch. Sito died in his early years, okay? And it's not in the DNA of the region to talk about, to do cooperative, to side with anyone on any security matters. There will be no Asian NATO. That's not a possibility. I mean, you can see East Asia moving into that with in particular, with the United States on that. But Southeast Asia will not join this. Seattle was dead from its beginning. So that will never happen, and especially with 10 countries having different stance on China and the United States. Danny's point about what China is doing is it damn it's do, damn it doesn't do, but this is the difference between political scientists and economists. Not everything's black and white. I'm just kidding. I'm always joking with Danny. No, I think that what we are actually saying is that the economic slowdown is actually a threat. Not a threat, not because China purposely does it, but it's a inevitable, not your inevitable cooperation, but an unintended consequence of what's happening, the effects on the region because of the dependency. I mean, I actually have some figures in the paper that I gave for this editor volume. For example, the ADB actually, this is from ADB, a 1% increase in China's economic output led to a 1.7% rise in ASEAN output in 2000. And that rose significantly over the years. In 2010, a 1% increase in Chinese output led to a 4.9% increase in ASEAN output. In 2010, a 1% increase in Chinese output led to a 6.3% increase in ASEAN output. So you can imagine the vulnerabilities when there is an economic slowdown, the vulnerabilities for ASEAN economy. So this is one of the vulnerabilities that my fellow panelists talk about is the excess capacity that came out. And there are all these reactions now from Thailand, from Vietnam, from Indonesia as well, which is that they are going to not take so much anti-dumping actions per se, but there's some of that going on, but there's also like they're trying to restrict the imports of these goods because they're hurting their own industries. So there's a risk from economic dependency. Everything that it's positive all have a negative side to it. I think that's one of the downsides of it. Okay, and then, okay, I have 1 minute left, but I don't know whether I have anything else I want to say. I can't remember what. Okay, I think I'm going to just stop here. And anything comes back to mind.
Okay. I still have some time.
Please,
Okay, on the question and comments first, on the sustainability and also the application of Vietnam de-risking strategy. So I do share your point on you have to have strategic assets and strategic relevance to play in that game. But here, I think the experience from Vietnam is you have to be willing to test the superpowers, right, on the value of your strategic assets. And I use the bamboo diplomacy, the question from Tony Sage, is so the origin of that policy is exactly the willingness of the Vietnamese leadership to test both China and the US. So the Vietnamese Secretary General of the party at that time was trying to get the second term, and he was being accused of pro-China because he wanted to visit the US, but all of the requests, informal requests, were turned down because unlike China, he's only head of the party, not head of the state, right? So Obama was very desperate to conclude TPP negotiation. And the message from Vietnam is that Vietnam will support TPP if Obama invited the Vietnamese head of the party to the Oval Office. And Obama agreed, right? So Vietnam agreed to Obama's demand for independent labor union that China warned Vietnam about. So Vietnam tests China in agreeing to the US on the labor chapter in TPP, allowing independent labor unions in Vietnam. In return, Vietnam tests the US willingness to recognize the Communist Party as leading the Vietnamese society by inviting head of the party, right, to the Oval Office. So he came back and he wrote a paper about Vietnam need to have a policy like a bamboo, solid in the root. That means solid in core interests, firm in the trunk, right? Firm in principles, but flexible in branches, like actions. You are willing to take risky actions, right? To test the superpower about how strategically important you are. And I also like your Germany analogy. So Vietnam, look at Germany, right? So Germany also trying to be friends to everybody, friend to Putin, Russia, banking on the competitiveness of German industry on cheap Russian gas. But then you also have to be willing to say, okay, if you have the Russian-Ukraine war, you are cut off or you decided to leave Russian gas. Are you, what is your next alternative, right? So same with Vietnam, right? Pursuing this for now, Vietnam is willingness to accept the risk of a Trump presidency 2.0, applying 10% tariff on Vietnamese exports, or China being more aggressive in the South China Sea. Right? So that's, and also on the next part is sustainability of that strategy on the economic front. So Tony asked the question about the difficulty of executing the industrial policy. So this is also Vietnam and also Southeast Asia. Really admire the industrial policy, the kind of smart state intervention, smart design and execution of Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese industrial policies, but can never replicate in their own countries because politics, corruption, right? Interest groups always take priority over efficiency and effectiveness, right? So a lot of, policymakers in Vietnam thinking, okay, let the politics announce the industrial policies, but making sure that they are not being executed, right? So they're telling FDI companies, domestic companies, you have my own support to invest in renewable energy, in semiconductors, but no way will have feed-in tariff for renewable energy, no way will have large subsidies for semiconductors. You're on your own, you have to compete. And we are willing to accept the fact that you decide to leave. Intel decide not to expand the plant because the government refused cash grants, right? Big player also decide to leave offshore wind because Vietnam refused expensive feed-in tariff. And that's the risk. You also, both like in security, but also in the economic sphere, that you, because in the end you say that those measures actually won't slow down your economic and development progress. But on the other hand, you are very willing to join various economic arrangements and actively lobbying, like for the CHIP Act, right? So for Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, Philippines included in the CHIP Act. But actually, so prepare for Trump to get rid of IPEF, even get rid of the CHIP Act, but prepare for Harris for CHIP Act 2, right? For CHIP Act 2, and saying that, okay, Vietnam is not like China, right? Philippines and Indonesia, we are not stealing American jobs. We are in a different kind of game. We are not stealing property, intellectual property rights, technology, right? And on the question about BRI, so this is there, I observe changes in China's BRI policy. I think they, deep down, they recognize their failure of their past and recent BRI projects in Africa and in South Asia. But they see opportunities in Southeast Asia where they can make their BRI works, not geopolitically, but also economically, right? To see that, okay, they will not turn into white elephant projects, right? They are banking on sustainable, rapid economic growth for Southeast Asia. So you build something, people and business will use it, right? And that will get the regional support for China BRI. And that, I see that they will focus on rail, particular high-speed rail, right? So they see that all leaders in ASEAN like high-speed rail projects, right? From low-income economies like Laos to upper middle-income economies like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, right? And threaten Vietnam. If you stay out of it, you will be disconnected, right? So they plan the Kunming, Vientiane, Bangkok, KL, Singapore for mainland Southeast Asia, and the Trans-Java, Jakarta, Surabaya, right? So they can, the same time they say, okay, we won't be, unlike the past, rigid, we'll be very flexible, right? It's not our initiative, but it's your own initiative. What kind of project structure you want, we will support. For Laos, it's almost 90% owned by China. Right? China is very happy with the railway Vientiane, Botan, Kunming. For Indonesia is Jakarta Bandung as the first line of the Jakarta Surabaya. It's a joint venture, 50-50 between Chinese state-owned companies and Indonesian state-owned companies. And they're willing to support financing without sovereign guarantee so that they can seal away from Japan the project. And they are telling Vietnam, okay, Vietnam will be 100% public investment. And we are willing just to be a contractor to build the rail. So even for Laos, they're very happy that, okay, now people, tourists, and also Lao people can travel on the semi-high-speed rail, not high-speed, right? Semi-speed rail Vientiane to Luang Prabang, right? Full high-speed, Jakarta to Bandung. Right? So that's, and for countries like Vietnam, it's also, I mean, like a very different question, whether to accept that. So for now, Vietnam is saying, not the north-south strategic high-speed rail in the BRI, but the two lines connecting Yunnan and Guangxi to also the northern provinces in Vietnam and the key port in North Vietnam. It's okay. Two rail lines. So testing that first, and then we'll see how it works. But I do see that's the China will be more aggressive in pushing for BRI, but also very flexible, not to be imposing on that on South. But Southeast Asia will be their focal point, and that's also, I think, come back to the nature of the economic challenge from the China's rise. So China is trying to prove that it will make benefits for the region. Yes, I think with both the infrastructure development and the shifts in the supply chain. And for Vietnam, it's like saying to China, right, it's very careful in the message from Vietnam to China in the shift in the supply chain is not moving away from China, but it's China plus one. So Vietnam and in general, ASEAN is China plus one. So for all investment in China, you're still in China. But your second and third factories plans will be in ASEAN, right? So that's I think that's how to manage. I think the challenge and the rise of China.
Okay, so I know there are probably questions are lurking there, but we don't have time for that. So this panel is now come to a full stop, completion. We all panelists here and participants from the floor, a big round of applause.